won't let Ethiopia off the hook. Restoring Washington's ties with Addis Ababa must not come at the expense of justice and accountability for human rights violations. From Foreign Policy, by Kate Hickson, the Advocacy Director for Africa at Amnesty International USA, and Kehinde A. Togun, the Managing Director for Public Engagement at Humanity United. 8 months after warring parties signed the cessation of hostilities agreement in Ethiopia, the United States is eager to re-engage in a full bilateral relationship with the Ethiopian government. According to a congressional notification seen by FB, the U.S. Treasury Department last month determined that Ethiopia no longer is engaging in a pattern of gross violations of human rights. Indeed, there is now a danger that the U.S. government is willing to deprioritize justice and accountability for the survivors of the conflict in exchange for a close relationship with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government. The cessation agreement, signed in November 2022 between the Ethiopian government and Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, came after 2 years of fighting that left hundreds of thousands dead from direct conflict and hundreds of thousands more dead from lack of access to food and medicine. While the conflict receives significantly less media attention, the death toll may be even higher than that in Ukraine. Following the agreement, the situation has improved for civilians, with desperately needed humanitarian aid and a restoration of services such as banking and telecommunications arriving in parts of Tigray. Nonetheless, human rights violations remain ongoing in Tigray, as well as in Oromia and Amhara. Just last month, Human Rights Watch reported that local authorities and Amhara forces continued to expel Tigrayans. No doubt, the atrocities have been perpetrated by multiple parties, including forces from the Ethiopian federal government, the TPLF, and the neighboring Eritrean Defense Forces, which was not a party to the cessation agreement. The international community is solely focused on Tigray, however, while largely ignoring tensions in other areas of Ethiopia, to the detriment of civilians in those regions. For example, in April 2023, Amnesty International raised concerns regarding journalists being detained amid rising violence and mass arrests in the Amhara region. Although the United States played a significant supporting role in getting both parties to the negotiating table, the agreement was publicly orchestrated by the African Union, AU. As a result, the agreement has been touted by the international community as an example of African solutions to African problems, and there's reason to celebrate this, especially in a region whose autonomy has often been sidelined in the context of great power competition. The peace agreement's success greatly depends on the United States effectively using its leverage to advocate for justice and accountability. Nevertheless, it's worth acknowledging that in many parts of the continent, accountability to, and for, people who have suffered human rights harms and abuses is sorely lacking. In fact, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights recently made the decision to terminate its Commission of Inquiry on the situation in the Tigray region, demonstrating a lack of political will to remain engaged. Consequently, as the agreement enters the implementation phase, its success greatly depends on the United States effectively using its leverage, along with the rest of the international community, to advocate for justice and accountability. U.S. influence on Ethiopia remains strong. Although Washington recently halted the provision of food aid to Ethiopia, the United States continues to be the largest humanitarian aid donor to Ethiopia. Ethiopia also greatly benefited from being a trading partner under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, a designation that was revoked during the protracted war with TPLF. The Ethiopian government is keen to once again have its products receive duty-free access to U.S. market goods through AGOA. However, in its revocation, the United States notes that before reinstatement, the Ethiopian government must first meet clear benchmarks toward the gross violations of internationally recognized human rights it has perpetrated. In 2022, the Biden administration released a new U.S.-Africa strategy document, calling for equal partnership with the continent in tackling both regional and global challenges. However, critics of the strategy have rightly highlighted the inherent tension between the administration's rhetoric of supporting human rights and its silence when some of its African partners may be contravening those same human rights principles. On Ethiopia, for example, the administration could have actively encouraged the AU to act with greater urgency. The AU was silent throughout the conflict in northern Tigray. even in the face of clear war crimes and crimes against humanity documented by leading human rights organizations. To live up to its espoused values, the United States must be willing to take more of a principled and prominent role in its partnership. The AU to ensure both Ethiopia and the TPLF are meeting their obligations. The international community, led by the African Union and the United States, must insist that the agreement be complemented with substantive efforts to pursue justice and accountability for and with survivors of the war. The current crisis unfolding in Sudan exemplifies what happens when the international community focuses on the immediate cessation of violence at the expense of real accountability.